All right, so participants are slowly joining. Guys, if it's possible, please let us know in the chat if you can hear us well and if you can see us. Let's sort out all the technicalities beforehand. Also, check out the platform a little bit and familiarize yourself with the Q&A sections and the like, because there will be quite a few interactive elements in the discussion too. So typically, Dr. Lewis, I guess 10:05 is where the number of participants gets to its peak, and we'll have, I guess, more people joining in. But just to save up the time, let's get straight to the interview that is a very long-awaited one. It was in the works for the last half a month. And for Dr. Lewis, I actually have two types of introductions. The first one is more formal, and the second one is an informal one. So on the formal front, Dr. Lewis is a Douglas Tracy Smith Professor of Comparative Literature, Professor of English, former President of Yale-NUS, and current Dean of Yale College. And I'm sure that I would be able to list, that's a long list of different positions and honors that Dr. Lewis has. On the informal front, Dr. Lewis has been one of the masterminds of the kind of education that I got at Yale-NUS, and together with incredible professors and administrators and staff and students themselves, they shaped the kind of education that I was exposed to, and the philosophy of it, the core values of it, is something that we try to push forward in our Freshman Academy venture. Dr. Lewis, I can only imagine how overscheduled you are these days, and thank you so much for taking the time. And I'll just remind the participants about the topic of today's discussion, which is the liberal arts system and liberal arts education, which is, not the kind of topic that students from Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and beyond are very exposed to. So I guess the first question to Dr. Lewis would be, what is your definition of liberal arts educational system, and how is it different from professional education that is more common in our region?
Thank you so much, Valeria. It's really great to be here, and I'm sorry I can't see the 63 other participants, but I hope they're hearing us well and that this is a useful session for them. So broadly speaking, we usually use the word liberal arts education to refer to the American system of college education. We call, the undergraduate years college in the US. And typically it's a 4-year program. And the distinctive things relative to how undergraduate education is done in the rest of the world are, as you said, it's not professionally oriented. So the goal of a liberal arts education is to give you a broad base, and that's the word liberal is related to freedom, but really its main meaning here is broad ranging and not, in a sense, utilitarian or practical. That isn't to say that it doesn't have practical skills involved in it. I think you learn, depending on your major and what you study, you can improve your writing skills, your critical thinking skills, your quantitative skills, learn scientific research, because the liberal arts encompass the sciences, but it is not sort of oriented to the job you'll get when you graduate. Now, in the United States, many students just graduate with a Bachelor of Arts or a Bachelor of Science from a liberal arts program and then go straight into the workforce. But a lot of them who want to pursue a profession will also go on to do a graduate degree in law or medicine or management or architecture, or any of the other professions. So it's also the case that we don't typically offer professional degrees at the undergraduate level. And I think the key factor, what results from the fact that we are less specialized at that point is, A, students don't have to decide what their main field of study is going to be, usually until their second year of undergraduate college. And B, during those first couple of years in particular, but also in a way through the whole 4 years, students have a chance to study across disciplines and not focus on a single thing, but look at problems from multiple perspectives. And so I think that's one of the strengths of the liberal arts system as it's developed in the US. And I know that I'm from Canada, and some universities in Canada pursue a similar system, and Yale-NUS in Singapore. And there are a lot of other universities around the world that have been trying to do some elements of a liberal arts education.
Yeah, and Dr. Lewis, you mentioned that typically when we mention liberal arts, it's referred to the American style education, but its roots are very much, is it the case that the roots of it are in the Greek tradition? And in the Greek tradition, the idea was that you develop good citizens rather than good employees, and that's where it's coming from. So the inspiration was very much coming from there.
That's right, and it has a very long history. So, but broadly speaking, in ancient Greece and in Rome and in medieval Europe and in sort of in parallel, especially in ancient China, there was a notion that to be well educated meant to have a broad set of skills, and those included the ability to speak well, the ability to write well, and just to think critically, and also scientific abilities, especially mathematical ones. And depending on the tradition, sometimes there would be an emphasis on astronomy, which was very important in the ancient world, or physics, or more in the modern period, physics. So this is a broad tradition of the well-educated person. And I think partly as a result of specialization in the 19th century, that got lost in many systems, and many systems have focused increasingly on specialization, especially at the university level, but in fact, even in the high school level, a lot of systems are quite specialized. There's an argument for specialization. I don't want to say that liberal education is for everybody, but I think the breadth is part of what makes American higher education particularly attractive to people. And I think, while I wouldn't necessarily export the exact model we have at Yale or other American liberal arts style universities to the whole world, I do think there are elements there that are useful in other parts of the world as well.
Yeah, and Dr. Lewis, if you allow, I think it would be useful if we use the liberal arts methods in exploring liberal arts itself. And I guess one of those things that don't sit really well, with me is that on the one hand, a liberal arts system is supposed to be for everyone, to make you a good citizen. On the other hand, at least in the modern times in the United States, liberal arts education is associated with more of this elitist angle. We typically refer to this private liberal arts institutions that are quite expensive and that are directed at a particular group of the population. Is it a recent phenomenon, or is it something that do you think will evolve, or should it evolve, and should it go to the broader population, sort of this liberal arts, I guess, philosophy of education, approach to education?
Right. Well, I think, I don't want to sound nationalistic or anything, and I was born in Canada. I'm a dual citizen of the US and Canada. But I think that understanding American history and the history of American democracy is important to understanding how this developed in the United States. And basically, in the 18th century, only a very elite group of students would, from mostly socially elite background, would go to schools. But the US had more, even less variation in the wealth of typical American citizens, or in those days colonists, than back in Europe. And so part of that meant that even in the 18th century, what are now the elite colleges like Harvard and Yale and Princeton were already educating, farmers' children. And one of our most famous graduates from Yale is Eli Whitney, who was an inventor, very influential inventor, but he grew up on a farm, and he only joined Yale as an adult, so he was a mature student. So it was not the case that they were only socially elite. They were also connected to the churches, and over the course of American history, they became more secular. But in the 19th century, which was the age of growing American democracy, they expanded, and the goal was to bring more students into the colleges. And many of the great public universities like Berkeley and Michigan and others and North Carolina were founded to educate a larger range of people with the same general style of the liberal arts colleges. They were not highly specialized institutions, although they had maybe a little bit more emphasis on practical skills. Now, in the 20th century, after World War II, we saw a huge expansion in American higher education. And for a long time, the US was a leader, and maybe 30% of students, of people of college age were graduating, which was a high number relative to the rest of the world. That growth has slowed a lot in the last 30 years, or 50 years, really, but we still have been gradually expanding the number of students who get higher education. It is true, though, as you imply, that probably only in the top 10 or 20% are there a lot of people who are taking the traditional liberal arts style education offered at Berkeley or Michigan or the other large public universities or the elite private universities and colleges. And a lot of the addition tends to be in more technical fields like you might do, obviously engineering is a separate question, but you might do like hotel management or topics that are directly preparing you for a job when you graduate. And that sector has grown more quickly than the liberal arts sector. And I think that's a result of economic pressure and the fact that it does require, to do a liberal arts education requires taking time. And if you desperately need a job and you don't want, you can't afford the time to develop in the broad way, then people tend to go for a more vocational training.
Makes sense. Thank you so much. And I guess this question, it neatly flows into the next one, which is this distinction between professional education and liberal arts education. Mm-hmm. And on the one hand, liberal arts is meant to instill this, I guess, value of free thinking and of creating very unique paths in one's career. But on the other hand, and that's a Yale statistic, 30% of Yale graduates, they end up doing either consulting or finance, which I guess might work both ways as an argument for liberal arts, that, liberal arts students can do those more, those fields, but also it puts into question I guess not just the motivations of students, but what prevails. Is it the economy? Is it economic considerations? So how do you sort of reconcile that? Is it, and also, is it something that I was always wondering that on the highest of levels of Yale, that you look into those statistics and you're saying, okay, maybe we'll do something about it. I know about this initiative of promoting entrepreneurship on campus through Tri-City Center and through other initiatives, but yeah.
So I don't feel bad at all about 30% of our students doing finance and consulting. And if it was 50%, I'd be okay with that. I will say, though, that I'd balance that with the fact that I want to make sure that students who want to pursue other careers, like maybe in the arts or working in government or in social services, or want to go on to be lawyers or doctors or get a PhD, that we have support for those options too. No, I'm not against capitalism. And so some of my friends think capitalism is terrible. If you think capitalism is terrible, you may think that going into finance is terrible. I don't think it follows. I think you can be a good citizen and have a good salary. But it is also the case, and this is regrettable, that there's a big gulf between the salaries paid in certain areas and the salaries paid in others. And we have been trying to admit a much more diverse range of students. If you come from a low-income background, it's very hard to turn down a job that pays very well, because that might help your whole family. And of course, many of our students from high income families will also prefer a job that pays a high income. We are not really in the business of telling students that by joining Yale, they should take a vow of poverty for the rest of their lives, but nor are we telling them you should definitely take the job that pays the most. That's a decision they have to make for themselves, but hopefully their education helps them at least to clarify their values and decide for themselves how they want to spend their time and their lives. And I think you'll find that Yale graduates, whether they're in the private sector or the public sector or academia, do tend to care a lot about service and citizenship. Some of them, of course, have political views that I don't agree with, but the fact that they're involved in politics and society is in a way a sign that education is working.
This is quite interesting, because I need to mention here that when we talk about, say, finance and consulting, if we disentangle that, and a lot of my friends, for example, are in consulting, but it seems like liberal arts students also, even if you are holding the views that maybe capital, like there's something that you need to say reform capitalism, or that there's a inherent problem in capitalism. A lot of these jobs are, say, in environmental consulting. So I guess these numbers can also be disentangled, and we cannot just take them as face value in that sense.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And again, I've only ever worked in the nonprofit sector, except for working in a restaurant for a few weeks when I was a kid. But I'm not against the for-profit sector, and that's what drives the economy. So, if we graduated students and they weren't capable of getting jobs in the private sector, I'd be very worried. I'm not worried about the numbers as they currently stand.
Received. And I guess, again, a very smooth transition to the discussion on diversity. And you mentioned that the goal is to admit the diverse pool of students with diverse career trajectories and diverse geographies. But as much as there is a push for diversity, there is a chance that some of those students that will be admitted will be coming from the kinds of backgrounds that might not adhere where students might not adhere to the values that a liberal arts holds so dear. For example, the idea of inclusivity or other foundational ideas. Is there any way of how Yale tries to integrate the students, or maybe integrate them in a way where their views can be unchanged while being part of Yale community? So how, again, this push for diversity, diversity and again, I guess political views.
That's a fantastic question. Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I guess I would say that the basic approach of a great university or college is to subject everything to scrutiny and help students subject things to scrutiny. And that includes the views of the professors and the administration. And we're trying to develop critical thinkers. I don't think we can assume that at the end of the time that they're here, they will share the values that I have, let's say. And I would hate to think that the result of a Yale education is that everyone will vote for the same candidate I would vote for, or see every political issue the same way I do. My goal is that they should be able to think about their situation thoughtfully and articulate reasons for their views, and be capable of having a conversation with somebody who has different views and either justify their own or be willing to change them. Now, I do believe that depends on a certain openness and, in a way, a certain kind of skepticism. That is, just because somebody says something is true doesn't make it true unless there's been some ability to defend that point of view. And we have to be open to those kinds of direct potential conflicts on campus. So while I'm extremely committed to having an inclusive engagement on campus and people feeling a sense of belonging, I don't think that should mean that there are taboo topics that we won't talk about. I think we need to be willing to have conversations. And while we might bring in students who have very, very differing views, and while some of them may change their views while they're here, others might leave with more or less the same views they had. After all, when you arrive at 18 or 19 or 20 years old, you're probably already pretty well formed, right? So we're not going to radically change people, but hopefully we do develop in them the habits of mind that allow them to think critically, and in particular to engage with others in a very diverse world. And especially, the United States is a very diverse country. And so the ability to talk to people from different backgrounds and work with them is particularly important here. But I think that's increasingly true all around the world.
But would you say that the context of this response would be different if we talk about smaller liberal arts institutions? And I can imagine that at Yale, you can always find people who you would agree with, because it's a big campus, and even the views that don't have that much of representation, you can always find people who you can relate to, even like in smaller circles. But if we talk about smaller liberal arts institutions, for example, Yale-NUS, that would be inherently more difficult. And even though there will be a push towards critical thinking, inevitably more people would converge around the same, or at least, at least there will be dominant ideas on campus.
Well, there certainly are dominant ideas on campuses, at Yale as well as at Yale-NUS. I actually thought that the Yale-NUS students, when I was there, which is a few years ago, had a pretty wide range of views and were not all sort of towing one line. We have lived in a world of a lot of political polarization, and not only in the US. And so what I've discovered is that a certain number of students choose their college or university because they think that the beliefs on that campus are the ones they have. And so that contributes to the sense that there's some dominant attitude that one campus is conservative or one is liberal, or, other differences like that. I think that's risky. I think we should really try and admit a student body that is similar in scope to the United States as a whole in all kinds of dimensions, and that we'll have better conversations on campus as a result. But I wouldn't be surprised to learn that, for example, maybe conservative students are more likely to choose a university in the South or something like that, rather than want to come to Yale. But nonetheless, we have very active conservative students on campus. So even though there might be a little bit of a liberal tilt, it's not like it's 100% or anything like that.
Oh, that makes total sense. And on the front of questioning your ideas and beliefs, and this is something that is coming from a professor who is working at Freshman Academy, and that was her question. Something that we have found a lot with our students is that at the beginning, especially if the student is pursuing a degree that is more philosophically oriented or social sciences oriented, there is a period at the beginning of college life where students become a little bit nihilistic, where a lot of their worldview is in shatters, and then there's this period where they need to create a new one, but it's not yet there. So do you have any advice for those students who are dealing with those, I guess, philosophical, quite existential questions almost at the beginning of their college life?
Well, I think it's good to address those philosophical and existential questions. Now, some people then have a propensity to get depressed. So I think the best solution to avoid getting depressed in that circumstance is to get enough sleep. That's the first thing. So everybody, although everybody loves the college nights debating until 4 a.m, I think it's actually good to go to bed at a reasonable hour. Now, I also think that people come to college for various reasons. But to some extent, when you arrive at college, having graduated from high school and grown, especially people who've grown up in one part of the world their whole lives, they may have only seen certain things. And so when you arrive at a diverse college, you will encounter views and ideas and even people from backgrounds that you've never encountered before. And that can be a little bit of a shock to people. So I don't think you necessarily even have to be studying philosophy or the social sciences to say, oh, it's not quite the way that I thought it was. I think you need to be open to growth. And I do think this period between, say, 18 and 24, something like that, people are still growing. Like there's neuroscience to back this up. So you need to have openness, but also recognize that, you will make it through, and that there is a life after college. College is a very intense experience, which is great. And it's just an important phase in growth. By the way, we talked mostly about the curricular dimensions of the liberal arts, but I should say that a distinctive feature in the US is that most students, at least above a certain level of selectivity, tend to go to a college or university away from their hometown. Whereas in Canada, where I grew up, most students went to the university in the town that they lived in, or the nearest university. And so the fact that you are traveling, living away from home, often on campus in a residence with a lot of other students, that's part of the experience. And so in a way, you're learning 24 hours a day, and part of that learning is social as well as intellectual. So just how to get along with people, how to share a bathroom, how to have a conversation over dinner, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and collaboration is something that you also mentioned in we found in different publications, but also in your speeches. The collaboration is one of the pillars of liberal arts education. But again, I will have to, due to my education, I'll have to push it a little bit. And the question is a little sketchy, but I'll take a risk and ask it. So on the one hand, we have collaboration, commitment to collaboration. On the other hand, any collaboration, it is built upon certain traditions, certain social constructs, certain ways of behaving that might not make sense from sort of this liberal arts point of view, and they need to be examined and they need to be kind of pointed out. So on the one hand, we are questioning norms, we're questioning human relations. On the other hand, we're behaving in a community where those norms are being developed. So again, it might be a little bit of a loaded question, but is there any way of how you're looking at this? So how to be sort of a skeptical individual, but at the same time operate? And that's also something that I'm seeing a lot in more practical dimension, seeing a lot with our students who go to Yale, and they study all these methods of exploring relations between people, hierarchies, certain norms, and they come back and they have, at the beginning, slight difficulty of operating in more traditional societies where there are norms and there are rules that you need to, operate within. Yeah,
that's really interesting. It's a complex and a slightly abstract question. I guess I would say that there are certain inherent norms in the university system. And probably the most important of those is that arguments are based on evidence and analysis. The kind of evidence and the kind of analysis that you use in different parts of the university varies. Sometimes it's more quantitative, sometimes it might be more textual or historical, and so on. But the basic claim that evidence and analysis are key does mean that can be in tension with traditional norms. For example, religious views that you might assert a certain religious view, and then you might be asked, well, how do you prove it? Truthfully, part of the way that American secularism has worked is just by ignoring those fundamental religious questions and just agreeing that we're going to talk about the non-religious dimensions of things. And we do have a problem now where our politics have become almost like a quasi-religion, in the sense that there are taboo topics, shibboleths, and so on, where there's a feeling like you may not, you know, if you don't agree with me on this, then you're beyond the pale, kind of thing. And I think the university has to reassert the fact that everything is up for debate. Now, that doesn't mean that every student has to give up their articles of faith, but it does mean they have to be willing to encounter, you know, challenging topics, and to argue on the basis of evidence. And for example, saying that my religion says this, or my political leader says this, or it's my deep belief, is not an adequate argument in an essay for a university paper, you know, that you're submitting at university. You need to marshal another kind of evidence for it. And I think that does lead to some challenges when you get out of the university and you're in a world where norms and hierarchies are accepted in some way. And so then you may have to adjust to the working environment or the social environment in a place that is that doesn't have that same operative norm of evidence-based argument.
And would that be correct to say that the kinds of students that Yale is looking for are, you know, regardless of whether they hold dogmas or not, they are those where their professional exploration or intellectual exploration is not affected by those dogmas? That's
interesting. Well, for example, so we certainly welcome students of any religion, and we encourage them to practice their religion while we're here. We have a large amount of support for that. There are certain states in the United States that have banned the teaching of evolution, or at least strictly limited the teaching of evolution, or it may be city school boards and so on. So we do now have students who arrive and they haven't studied evolution when they get here. Now, if you want to learn about biology or medicine and so on, you have to learn about evolution. I don't mind if deep in your heart you believe that God created the universe in 7 days, but you can't, that's not a reason not to study evolution and understand how evolution works. And so how people reconcile that is challenging, but I think actually plenty of people of faith don't have too much trouble reconciling whatever their religious belief is with the study of evolution, for example. Now, evolution is a specific kind of issue because it's a scientific theory that is sometimes seen as being, you know, a challenge to religions. Other examples, like studying the history of liberal democracy, are more complicated. You can study the history of liberal democracy and think that various mistakes have been made. You might think that, you know, liberal democracy didn't put enough emphasis on social equality, and therefore people, you know, people of minorities or lower income people were treated poorly because elites came to dominate liberal democracy. Or you might think that liberal democracy is too lax and that it's allowed society to become decadent in certain ways, and that you shouldn't be allowing abortion on demand or whatever. You can come with any of those views, but what you're studying in a way is the history of liberal democracy and the arguments for it. And you may make philosophical arguments about how it should be different, but they're on the basis of, again, argument and evidence, not assertion. And that's the key issue, I think.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So I guess on that section, we covered quite a scope of questions. And I tried to, sorry for bombarding you with those, but
no, those were great.
I'm
glad to see
conscious.
You had a good education.
It's almost like a compliment in your direction too. It goes both ways. I try to bombard you with all the questions, being conscious of the time limits that we have, and we have about 15 minutes to ask the rest of those. And the next section that I wanted to discuss was the future of liberal arts outside the US. And you mentioned at the beginning of our discussion that the liberal arts model should not be exported. Just nominally, was copying and pasting essentially all the different dimensions of it in a new geography. And I do remember, and again, this is something that's very personal to me, because I do remember that, fateful day where all the Yale-NUS classes were canceled, and then we were all, congregating in our dorm rooms and in this stacked, all dorms that are stacked in those Yale-NUS skyscrapers, basically. And that decision, when you were also a part of that announcement, and it was a very, I guess, back in the day, it was much more emotionally charged moment, and we had some time to think about it and think through this. But ultimately, the question is Yale-NUS closure, or I guess planned closure, the beginning of the end of the liberal arts projects outside the US? I guess it's more of a generic question, but the one that would be good addressing.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we should distinguish international partnerships from liberal arts education. So I think liberal arts education has been something that Asian governments in particular, and most education is funded by government in most of Asia. So that Asian governments have looked at with some interest over the last even 20 or 25 years. And in the Asian democracies like South Korea and Japan, you see a little more investment in it. But even in China, and also in other places like Singapore and so on, and Vietnam, you do see a growth of liberal arts approaches. In China, they're often referred to as a whole person education, and so which in a way sidesteps the political dimension of it. I do think those will always be part of the tug of war. So a given government may think that it's a good idea to invest in liberal arts education because it helps to educate more creative or critical thinkers I don't like to act as if people who do a law degree or a medicine degree or an engineering degree aren't also critical thinkers. But one of the advantages of liberal arts is that they get exposure to a wide range of things and don't have to choose a specialization as early in their career. And that's appealing to a lot of people, and therefore also to a lot of educators and a lot of governments who are oriented towards improving education. But it does come with some certain political implications. And in the more authoritarian countries, I think that has caused some challenges, particularly in China. But even in, relatively democratic countries with some authoritarian elements, I think that we will see some challenges around that. Now, separately, I think international collaboration is a big challenge, both because of COVID, US-China tensions, the war in Ukraine. I think we will see fewer large partnerships between an American or British or other Western university and another part of the world. NYU is still operating very effectively in the UAE and in China and at other locations. And I think they'll keep going, but I don't think we'll be seeing new ones start. And that's because the international situation is just much more difficult than it was a dozen years ago when we started Yale-NUS.
Noted. And I guess there are two questions that follow from your response. The first one is whether true liberal arts education, at least in its, I guess, American conception, but also being true to its Greek origins, it requires a certain political environment within which such education should operate.
Well, so I was named after Pericles, the Greek statesman, and in Thucydides' Peloponnesian War, Pericles says that Athens is a school for Greece, and that the democratic Athens allows people to be diverse to have diverse interests and skills, essentially many of the things we attribute to a liberal education today. And at the same time, or shortly thereafter, Plato was founding the academy and so on. But remember that the citizens of Athens were only about 10% of the population. No, there were slaves, there were women, there were a lot of people who weren't part of the citizenship. So democracy has meant different things in different times. Today, everybody's a citizen in our democracy, but we certainly know that not everybody has equal access to high quality higher education. I think if you create a certain kind of academic freedom that allows people to pursue research and teaching questions on campus, you can do that even in an environment that is otherwise not liberal and in which there are authoritarian constraints. And for evidence, I don't want to suggest that China is the only authoritarian country in the world, but you can just see that some Chinese universities have successfully created liberal arts programs. Undoubtedly, they operate under different constraints than I do in New Haven, but it's not like the United States is the world's perfect democracy either. And there are lots of constraints that we operate under too. There's no place in the world that's a perfect democracy, and you don't need to be a perfect democracy in order to have a liberal arts education.
Received. And on that question of establishing liberal arts projects outside the US, you said that the partnerships might diminish and it will be more challenging because of those geopolitical considerations. But based on that Yale-NUS experience that you had, is there any advice that you would give to someone who would be so I guess, idealistic or
Yeah.
maybe just ambitious in establishing such an institution. And I was not surprised to know that even in Central Asia, we have a liberal arts institution, American University of Central Asia, based in Bishkek. And that seems to operate in a very similar fashion, just the kind of discussions that the students have to the American model, I guess, of liberal arts, not to the kinds of models that you also mentioned that try to, that operate under those. So it is still, at least in our region, you still see some successful projects. So if anyone were to establish one, what would be, certain things that you would advise them to look into?
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with the one you mentioned, but I have talked to people at the American University of Beirut, and I think a lot of these go back to American government trying to help to support the development of, the American style education, which is connected to allyship and democracy. Again, American style democracy. I'm not trying to make a strong political statement there. I think my advice would be, if it's a partnership, be clear on what both partners are looking for, and be clear on the timeline, and of course be clear on the finances. And I think if you're clear on those things, you can accomplish a partnership. But I think it is quite challenging. Yale chose to put its name on Yale-NUS, and that made a big investment. MIT has a lot of very good projects that they've done internationally, but they don't put their name on it. And so when they then withdraw, it's not so noticeable. So MIT is no longer a partnership in the Singapore University of Technology and Design. They helped to set it up, but then they left. But it wasn't really noticeable the way it is when you take the Yale name off Yale-NUS College. So should we have not put the Yale name on it? I don't know. I think by putting the Yale name on it, we said this is a very important thing, but we also opened ourselves up to the potential crisis when the name came off.
Well, I'm certainly happy that you did put Yale name on it, so I would not complain there for all intents and purposes. But yeah, makes sense. And I guess this second section of questions that I planned for this interview is most of it we're able to address, and the last one, and I guess the most recent concerns and issues and questions and I guess worries and both opportunities lie in these new technologies that have appeared. And you are a professor of English and comparative literature. I would say that 5-10 years ago there was a worry and concern about artificial intelligence, but I would say more people thought that it would go more into say driving or certain fields that do not require necessarily that can be more automated, at least on the surface and things like that. And then this year or in the past couple of years, we're seeing where artificial intelligence is going into creative fields, which is traditionally seen more of the liberal arts domain. So first of all, were you surprised that those fields would be the ones to be disrupted first? And then is there a Yale strategy, or maybe in the thinking of I guess the top management of the university, are there any considerations regarding ChatGPT and other artificial intelligence tools?
Well, I wouldn't say I was massively surprised, just because I'd seen some evidence of it coming up. But when ChatGPT launched, I was sort of struck by its ability to write a relatively simple 5-paragraph essay that isn't necessarily full of errors. It depends a little on what you ask it. It does not currently check its errors. It doesn't cite sources, and it's basically based on a language generation technology, from what I understand, rather than, it's not like a search engine that would go and find the answer to something. And now you could easily imagine combining a search engine with some artificial intelligence so that you could have a more accurate essay that it would write for you. I was asked by the trustees to write a little report on this, so I got ChatGPT to write a report for me on it, and then I shared that with the trustees and I explained, I didn't pretend that it was my own work, and it was a perfectly decent report, and it said you should form a committee to study this matter. And so, that's always what a university administration does, is form a committee. But I think the truth is that, ChatGPT can write some basic essays, and I think that's a useful tool that people will want to use in the future. We should be teaching our students by university level, higher level skills, where they're analyzing things at a level that ChatGPT can't imitate.
Mm-hmm.
But I admit that it isn't easy to do that. And you have to, as a professor, think about the prompt. If you're worried about students plagiarizing or using ChatGPT to write their assignments, you have to think about prompts and questions that won't be easy for ChatGPT to answer. On the other hand, at some level, it's a contract, and students who use ChatGPT to do their work without, confirming that that's permitted by their professor, and some professors might permit it, are just cheating themselves by not learning how to write. I think not everybody's going to be an equally good writer. ChatGPT could, in the long run, help people write basic things or a similar artificial intelligence. And then hopefully what we teach students at Yale or Yale-NUS or NUS College is a kind of a critical ability to think about arguments at a level that the artificial intelligence can't. And hopefully that leads to a higher level of skill. Now, when it comes to other creative fields, I worry a lot about painters. I think that if you spend time on social media, there's a lot of junk that is generated by AI, sort of news, pseudo news. They take the news from somewhere else, they rewrite it and they publish it. And so that means jobs for journalists that are gone. So it's definitely going to have an impact. But compare it to the invention of the calculator. It used to be that we, in math class, just 50 years ago, we taught students long division and we taught them techniques for figuring out, all kinds of things that now are just done by a hand calculator or by a computer. And so, we evolve, and it's just going back to the Luddites. There was a concern that the power mills would mean that the traditional weavers didn't have a job anymore, or when the coal mines started to disappear in England. At all times in history, there have been new technologies that create innovation. And then what humans do is figure out how to use those technologies and have other jobs as well. But in the meantime, it creates a lot of disruption. And so certainly I would be worried about being a journalist in mid-career right now and not knowing how to respond to this challenge. And I know some artists who are also concerned that, like graphic art, if a publisher can just get a computer to draw a cartoon, then why hire an actual cartoonist, that kind of thing. So it's definitely a challenge.
So when we're hearing the statistics, and by the way, I don't know where the many experts that popped up with the news of ChatGPT, where they're taking those statistics, but you can hear something along the lines of 30% of colleges closing in X years. So you're not seeing that as an existential threat, and you're seeing that more of as a calculator that was introduced to the educational system 50 years ago.
Well, Yale is not a typical college. Our problem is that if we rest on our laurels and just keep doing the same thing we've always done, we will eventually become irrelevant. But we won't disappear because we have a strong endowment and a strong brand and so on, but we could get worse. So we should try and get better instead. But I do think that some small colleges will eventually fold. They don't fold as fast as people think they will, because a lot of times the community, sometimes the church, if they're connected to the church, or the alumni group, care a lot about it, and the faculty too. And so often they find ways to continue. But I think the smaller colleges that are independent and that are not wealthy are facing real challenges. And so some of them will probably become more vocational. There are lots of interesting things. Some of them now have retirement communities so that the older people can come and attend the classes, and that generates revenue for the college. So it isn't easy to run a small college. The economics of it are tough because it's a very expensive and it's very intensive kind of work, especially if you have small seminars. You have to hire a professor for every 8 students, and the economic, and then you have to have nice buildings and somewhere for the students to live. So it's not easy, but I don't think ChatGPT is the reason that small colleges are under some kind of threat. And then in the big public universities, the main concern is public funding, but in some states, there's also a lot of pressure on the content of the education that comes from especially conservative lawmakers who want to regulate what can be taught at universities, which I think is a huge mistake, but that's going to be a big pressure in the coming years.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lewis. I mean, that was 45 minutes sharp, and we'll try to stick to our schedule today and let the participants also ask some questions. At the beginning, I felt like not that many people we're willing to ask questions, particularly because, again, there's this gap in terms of, understanding the liberal arts system. And today we spoke about liberal arts, I would say on a relatively complex way. And as someone who were, on your end, you were building those systems. On my end, I was just the recipient of what essentially you have built and with your colleagues. But I guess I would address the participants. Please send us your questions. Again, the three main areas of concerns and questions that you might address would be liberal arts education itself, ChatGPT and the recent technologies, and the liberal arts institutions outside of the United States. So these three broad groups of questions. Okay. So again, we have more logistical ones, the differences between education in Canada and the United States. So I guess
I could address that if you like.
Yeah.
Do you want me to address that one?
Yeah.
So I should say an important thing to know about the US is that there's a huge variety of institutions. There's at least 3,000 different degree granting institutions. There are the large private research universities like Yale and the other Ivy League universities, but also like Johns Hopkins or Stanford or the University of Chicago. And they have long histories, and they are usually funded in part by gifts, and they're high tuition, but they often have very good financial aid, so it's worth applying to them. There are the small liberal arts colleges, which are independent and which are usually undergraduate only. So unlike the big research universities, they don't offer PhDs and graduate degrees. And so you're only with other undergraduates there. You often get a very intense relationship with faculty at a small college like that. And the faculty tend to be very engaged with the students. You may not have as many research opportunities. And part of it goes to the question you asked, Valera, about small community versus large community. Some of those are religiously oriented. Not very many of the large research universities are religiously oriented anymore, but there are Notre Dame and Georgetown, which are affiliated with the Catholic Church. And then there's the large public universities, both the flagships in each state, like University of Michigan, University of California at Berkeley or UCLA, University of North Carolina, and so on. And those are excellent, excellent universities. They've had a little bit of financial pressure because governments are funding them less well than they used to, but they're still great universities. And then in each state, there are also other levels of education that are less selective. So, Michigan State, for example, or Central Connecticut State here in Connecticut. And then there are the community colleges. So there's a very, very wide range. Canada, it's a little bit more of a focus on the large public universities. Almost all universities in Canada are funded by the government. They tend to be larger than the small liberal arts college, although there are some smallish ones where you can get an American style, more or less, experience of living on campus in a liberal arts education. But for the most part, I went to McGill, the University of Toronto, University of British Columbia. They very closely resemble Berkeley or Michigan. They're large public universities. They tend to be a little bit more, you'd specialize a little bit earlier in Canada than in the US, but the difference is not massive. The Canadian system is relatively similar to the US system.
Mm-hmm. Azamite, I hope that your question, if you have any follow-up questions, you can send it in the Q&A section. Also, we have a mixture of some more informed questions and some funny ones, like this one from anonymous attendee. Do Yale consider itself the best one? I mean,
we aim to be the best one. There's a lot of debate about the rankings. I think the rankings have useful information in them, but they're not always, you shouldn't follow the rankings blindly. We tend to be very well ranked in the social sciences and the humanities and the life sciences. We have a very strong medical school. We have a well-known law school. Those are graduate subjects, but it does affect the undergraduate. We're very highly ranked for undergraduate programs. We're building in engineering and the physical sciences, where we're pretty good in physics, but in the more applied areas, we've underinvested in the past, and we've just announced big investments there. So I hope that 10 years from now, our engineering will be, if not as highly rated as our very top schools, at least in the top 10 kind of situation. So, but I think there are good reasons to come to Yale to study engineering and computer science. Rather, you might want to go to Stanford or MIT, but if you're also interested in art or history, or you play an instrument, there are opportunities at Yale that really don't exist elsewhere, because we do have some of the great art schools in the world, the arguably number one in art, architecture, music, and drama, certainly in the top 5 in all of those fields. And undergraduates have some access to that as well. So we're a very broad university.
All right. So I hope again the anonymous attendee is satisfied with the response. There are many more anonymous questions now. All right. So let me go through some of them. There's a question about comparative literature, and the question is, what's the role of it today, and how will it will change? Is it still relevant? I guess we can group it in that group of questions about subjects like history, comparative literature, those that on the surface, most people might wonder what is the practical. I guess there are a lot of questions about the practical application of the liberal arts fields. Yeah.
So intellectually, comparative literature has gone from a field where most of the focus was on the history of European literature and the classical inheritance, with some people working on the classical Asian literatures like Chinese and Japanese literature, but to a much more diverse thing that covers the whole world. The upside of that is we're much more, we cover a lot more. The downside is that people don't necessarily know what the other specializes in. So the expert in South American literature might not know much about Uzbeki literature or, what have you. But, that's okay. I think comparative literature actually is a very good subject to study now. Now, if you're asking about professions, in the US, after you graduate with a degree in one of the humanities subjects like history or comparative literature or English or art history, you might go on to do a PhD in that topic. But I think probably more people either go into just private sector work, and they may have also studied economics. That's one of the things you can do is take economics and history or economics and art history. Or they may go into areas in which a humanities background is very useful, which would include journalism, education, sometimes policy kinds of orientation, working in a museum or a library. Now, those are very important, excellent jobs. As you sort of said, Valeria, they don't pay as well as working in finance. So I do see a certain tendency of our students to gravitate to the higher paying jobs. I don't think that makes them morally bad people. I think that's just the way the world is. But there are plenty of our students who graduate in the humanities and go on to work in fields that are relevant to the humanities.
But also, I would just add here, and from my very recent experience of graduating, a lot of my friends from Yale-NUS, they switched from the subject that they studied to the fields that again, you would never expect that there is any connection between them. And I guess one of the examples would be my friend who studied politics and economics philosophy, and then he went into aviation consulting, having no experience in doing anything related to aviation consulting, and doing that on quite a high level. So yes, and I it's not just politics, economics. I've seen those very interesting explorations happening and interesting career trajectories from, say, biology to managerial positions, and this is all not that unheard of on college campuses, I would say.
Right, and in the U.S. in particular, employers aren't necessarily looking for one particular major in order to give you a job. They're looking for broad ability.
Yeah. And I guess back home also that might be relevant. We have this phrase that a lot of students who graduate from universities hear from their employers. I don't know if that's the case in the United States, but we hear something along the lines of forget everything that you learned in the college. So I guess this would apply to professional schools a lot, where you're taught some more, I guess, tangible models, but I guess with liberal arts education, it's much more flexible. And I can't imagine forgetting what I learned at Yale-NUS. That would mean that I would forget, I guess, thinking skills, analytical ability, writing. Yeah, it's something that is, that you cannot forget, I guess, to a large extent. It's a different kind of information and skill set.
Yeah, I left Singapore just as our first students were graduating. So I've heard a little bit from employers in Singapore, but not as much. But certainly employers in the US, my experience is they tend to find that Yale graduates, and I think this is true of Yale-NUS graduates, are very capable of leadership and analytical kinds of roles. They do sometimes also need to learn some particular skill, like, for example, they might not know as many computer languages as a peer in a certain kind of job, but usually we've hopefully trained them well to be good at learning, so they can learn the language or whatever needs to be learned relatively quickly and effectively.
So we have another very interesting question from Murad, who is asking, are there certain students who may not benefit as much from a liberal arts education, such as those who are more practically minded or those with specific career goals? We sort of touched upon that, but yeah, anything else to add to that discussion?
Well, it depends a little on your social situation in your home country. So, for example, if you know that you want to be a working engineer, we do offer an engineering degree at Yale. We didn't at Yale-NUS, and at the Yale engineering degree, you'll be in great shape when you graduate. And even when I visited MIT, they said we offer a liberal arts style engineering approach. So they have many of the features of a Yale education in terms of studying other subjects besides engineering while you're getting your engineering degree. But engineering might be a case where you want a more specialized degree. If you're in the performing arts and you want to be a musician, we have great programs for music here, but you're not spending all your time on your music. And so some people would choose to go to conservatory and just focus on music. That's a heavy bet in a way, because if it doesn't work out, you haven't got, you're sort of got one area that you're focused on. And in a country where medicine and law are undergraduate subjects, you may decide, well, I know I want to be a doctor, so I'm going to go to medical school at the age of 18. But a lot of countries are thinking about when is the best time to start medical school. And I think there is a feeling among a lot of educators that 18 is too young to start. So spend 18 to 22 studying more broadly, including maybe biology, but other subjects that might be relevant, ethics, history, whatever, and then go to medical school as a graduate degree. But that depends a little on the system in your home country.
And I guess we can end today's interview with a very light question from Islam. So he discovered the many online courses that Yale posted. And his question is how that experience of taking those online courses different from traditional offline, experience. So, I mean, some of this would be obvious, but is there anything that perhaps, if you did not experience that kind of offline education, you would not necessarily pinpoint?
I think the online education courses are great. And I think mostly there you get a lot of the content, like the history of a certain country or the basic methods of economics or what have you. And those are great. What you don't get is and some of them do have very nice exercises where you can test whether you've learned the material. And sometimes I don't know how many of our Yale courses have this, but you can even be graded on those and learn whether you're learning. I think learning it at a higher level does require some more practice, which is harder to do when you're online and not directly in contact with the faculty. I also think on campus, you get to meet with other students and talk about the material, whether in a discussion section or just in an informal way or in a study group. And so I do think there are things that you don't get there. There's a whole other dimension of liberal arts education we haven't focused on as much, which is just the living together and participating in clubs and social events and writing for the student newspaper or playing sports. And of course, that isn't available online, but you can get a lot from those online courses. So I think they're very worthwhile. At least at Yale, you would not get a degree, at least not an undergraduate degree online. We do offer some of our master's degrees online. So, from a certification point of view, I think there are some pretty good online degrees, but if you are able to do an in-person one, I think that's still sort of the gold standard.
Yeah, and I would certainly attest to this idea that doing it in a classroom with diverse classmates, you start seeing how coming from different places, you see the material differently. It almost like at the beginning, you might think that there's only one interpretation and yours interpretation is very accurate. And then you see an entirely different world of viewing a certain topic, and that truly expands the thinking process and the analytical process there too. Dr. Lewis, thank you so much for this opportunity. And,
thank you, Blair. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, for many of students here, this is the closest that they have ever been to, those, again, for many of them, the way they see it, sort of esoteric institutions, Ivy League. Again, we have just recently been open to all that. And I'm glad that we were able to address a very important topic. Again, not all of it. We covered some more, I guess, contentious, sometimes theoretical and abstract questions. But thank you so much for this opportunity.
Truly a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Have a good day and I guess rest of the week. And thank you so much for joining.
Bye. Bye, everybody.